Hey guys, welcome back. We have our next lecture in the Reform era, or the so-called Gilded Age, the age of what will eventually become the progressives. And we are taking a look at some of the negative impacts that Industrial Revolution had at this point in time, the late 1800s, early 1900s. Eventually, we will make our way to part two, where we will talk about how they attempted to reform those various issues. But we are still in the negative part, and we're going to take a look at some of the bad things that are happening in this Gilded Age, the corruption, the rottenness underneath all the shiny gold of the wealth, the tremendous wealth, and the new inventions and all that good stuff. Today we are going to be talking about economic systems, and I know. Just to be brutally honest, economics was my worst topic I ever studied in college. So I will attempt my best to explain it to you guys. I know that's not reassuring at all. But think about economics in how we trade, right? So when you go to the store, right, and you buy, let's say, a Diet Coke. I love Diet Coke. Okay, let's say that you go to the store and you put down $1 for a can of Diet Coke. They give you that. You've just exchanged money for a product, right? You're happy, they're happy. That is how it works. Now multiply that by the literally billions and billions of transactions that happen on a daily basis, not only in our communities and our country, throughout the globe, right? That is how economies thrive, right? We get the goods we want, and we give our resources, in this case dollars, to someone else, which they want. So, when there's more trading, it's good, and it leads to more prosperity for everyone else. That is called a free market. Okay, when you have the ability to trade goods and resources for other goods, okay? So we live in a capitalist society, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this and fully define them later on. Now, at the time period we're studying, the Industrial Revolution, there were a lot of, there was a big income division, right? Last unit we talked about these multi-billionaires of Rockefeller and Vanderbilt. They have a level of wealth that has hardly been known by any humans in history. At the same time, what's happening in America is that the poor are getting poorer. Right, you have people that are working in cities and factories that are literally working to the point where they're dying in some cases, and they're hardly making enough money, if they're making enough money, to put food on the table. Right, so this to a lot of people was a big problem. How can we support an economic system in which you have some people end up with extreme wealth, wealth more than they could ever use in a lifetime? And then on the other side, you have people who are working extremely hard and are making little to nothing, barely being able to afford to have shelter and food, okay? A lot of people said, we need to perhaps have a better economic system. Now, this is a very politically divisive issue, and, I am not here to tell you what is right and wrong. My goal for today's lecture is to demonstrate today what some of the alternate theories were that people proposed in the late 1800s, and even before that, that they're saying, maybe this would be a better alternative to capitalism. And some countries have adopted some of these other economic systems, like socialism and communism, and for with all varying degrees of success and failure. So again, my goal is not to tell you what should happen. My goal is to tell you what people proposed at the time. And this is a period where they're saying, could we make progress in this area of economics? So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the notes here. And I want to start here by talking about what many people felt was really the biggest problem of the age, and I think simply put that could be summarized as greed, right? You have, we talked about that term robber barons. These guys are literally making billions of dollars in today's money, and the very people that are working for them, making them this money, are starving to death. And they're saying, how greedy can you get that this would be the system that is in place? So a lot of people question, is capitalism the right thing for America? Is this something that we want to continue? If we keep going down this road, do the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer? So they start to question it and say, maybe there's another alternative out there. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look. All right, so the first definition that we need to look at in our notes is just defining capitalism. And I kind of took you through that scenario of, when you go to the marketplace, you buy a good, you give them money, they give you the good, everybody's happy, right? That is how markets work, right? Selling goods, trading resources for things that you want and need. So to define capitalism, which is the system that we have here in the United States, okay, that is an economic system in which the means of production, that's a confusing phrase, but the means of production, think about, industries or, how things are produced, factories, right? They are owned by individuals. You could go home and, you could apply to start up an LLC and you could create your own business if you wanted to, maybe selling, t-shirts or something. Okay, you could create your own business. And, this is where a lot of America's success stories start out. People that do take that risk and go out there and risk it all and work hard to build up their own businesses, their own doctor's practices, whatever it may be. And they put that time and effort and invest that energy into a business and hopefully they thrive, right? That is what capitalism is all about. Now, the basis of capitalism is free markets, okay? That the government would not interfere. Now, how could the government interfere? Well, there's a couple ways. So we're talking about things like even taxation could be considered government interference, right? If the government is taxing what you are making, if they are taxing the money that you are bringing in, they are interfering in your ability to gain more wealth. Okay, so that's one example. Regulation, okay? In a completely laissez-faire capitalist society, there would be no regulations of any sorts. And we'll talk later on about why that might not be the best thing. But, regulation where the government says, I don't think it's a good idea. Or let's take, like the meatpacking industry. Usually we read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. There were little regulations that were being followed in the late 1800s in the meatpacking industries in places like Chicago. And so, you had things like, rats falling into the meat grinder, and there's no one there to say, hey, that might be a safety issue, against public health. Let's shut down that meat. No, they just kept it going. Said, we gotta turn a profit. Okay, so we got to keep these machines running. Doesn't matter if an employee falls in and grind up his bones. It doesn't matter. Keep it going. It's all about profit. Regulation, it would be a form of government interference that said, perhaps we need to step in and, there needs to be some level of health and safety. Now, regulation can go too far. And, I think this is one of the biggest basis of the division between Republicans and Democrats is, how much regulation is too much. And this is where a lot of the political parties divide on. Again, not here to tell you what's right or wrong, just kind of what is the reality. Now, what is positive about capitalism is that prices tend to be kept low, right? Because the prices, businesses basically set it themselves. If you went to the store and a gallon of milk was $10, well, you'd say, I'm not paying $10 for that, especially when I can drive a mile down the road to another grocery store and it's $2, right? You're going to go there. And that's how markets work. Supply and demand are what sets the prices for goods. It's not the government, okay? It is the supply and demand. If there is a lot of something available, odds are the prices are going to be low, okay? If there's, I think about like every time that these new Jordan sneakers come out, right? Every time there's a new set of Jordans that come out, they go for just insane prices, right? Well, why is that? Well, it's because the supply is low and the demand is high. Okay, that is how prices get set in a capitalist society. Okay, so that is what we have with a little regulation. We'll talk a little bit more detail about this later on, but that is kind of the basic definition of what capitalism actually is. All right, now let's move on. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, this was the system in place in the late 1800s, and people were saying, this isn't really working out for everyone, right? The division of income, the rich are getting a lot richer, the poor are getting a lot poorer. How can we make this a little bit more equal for everyone? So there were different theories that were pushed, and one of those was called socialism. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about Karl Marx later on, but let's discuss what socialism is. And I will mention that this is, once again, a very politically divisive word. And a lot of this comes from our history throughout the Cold War, where we were fighting against, ideologically fighting against, communist nations and socialist countries. But let's look at what the actual definition is, okay? In socialism, it means that the major means of production, not all, okay, but the major means of production are owned by the state, okay, and that's just another way of saying the government, all right? The government owns the major means of production. So income can be shared through taxes, and what that means is that in socialist economies, your tax rates are much higher. Okay? Sometimes it might be 40%. I have a friend who lives over in Scotland. They have, healthcare is much more provided than it is here in the United States. But they pay upwards, upwards of 40% of their income in taxes. They pay a lot higher tax rate, but yet they have some things provided for them. And that last line there, the government provides, in most cases, it's healthcare, education. I know in some European countries, that have higher tax rates, people there don't necessarily go into debt over going to college, right? They don't take on these tens of thousands of dollars worth of loans to get a college degree, but they do pay higher taxes. There's a balancing act. There's a trade-off. Again, not saying what's right or wrong, just kind of the reality of the situation throughout the world. Now, I would, often today when socialism comes up, it is kind of used as a nasty word. Oh, he's a socialist, and perhaps there's good reason for that. I would beg you to take a step back and actually look at some of the programs we have in place in the United States, and I think you might realize that we actually have more socialism here than you may suspect. For instance, public education, okay? My salary is not paid by you, the students, okay? My salary is paid by tax dollars. So the community comes together and decides to set rates on taxes, and that tax money is used to pay for things like roads and education, all of those things that we realize we are better off by providing at least a basic level. Okay, so that again is kind of a socialist program. Bigger nationwide things, you have Social Security, where you reach a certain age. I think now it's like 64 maybe, and the government, it's kind of like a little bit of a cushion in your retirement years. The government cuts you a little bit of a check. Okay, well that comes from people that are currently working, and but it was necessary when it started in the Great Depression, because all these people were, reaching the point of their life where they could not work, and they were literally starving to death and becoming homeless. So the government said, here's a little bit of a safety net, and started pushing that idea of Social Security. And it's immensely popular. That doesn't mean there's not issues with it, okay? There's a lot of issues with Social Security, and we'll talk about those at the very end of this unit. But my goal here is just to get you to realize that we don't always call it socialism, but we do have a lot of socialist programs that are in place that many of us enjoy. Now, can it go too far? Of course, and people would argue that any tax money taken by the government is too much. But ultimately, nations have to decide how much are we willing to give up to provide for people that may either need help, or to provide for, again, in terms of like education. It's good to have a basic level of education. It's good to have an educated populace that can at least read things like road signs. Socialism, it's a word that gets thrown around quite a bit. But when we look at these exact definitions, you'll see that, again, it's not one size fits all. There are socialist governments, especially in places like Europe, where education is provided, like I said. So it's not all or nothing, right? And often we misapply the term. Now, if we go even farther, okay, with the kind of the economic spectrum, okay, we arrive at what's called communism. Okay, if you had capitalism on one side, communism would be on the far other side. On the bottom right there, That is the economic philosopher Karl Marx. Okay, he was a German philosopher born in the late 1700s or at least early 1800s. But he grew up in Germany, and he lived in places like England and France at the time the Industrial Revolution was really kicking off. And he saw a lot of these problems that were being created by capitalism, which is, by the way, capitalism is relatively new. I didn't mention that. This is a fairly new philosophy. Before capitalism, most countries operated on a mercantilist philosophy and system, but that kind of went away, especially in the 1700s, when you have kind of the rise of these new nation states like the United States. So anyways, I'm getting off topic. But Karl Marx was being raised in this era where he saw a lot of the income, the division of income, that the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. And again, he theorized that eventually this would not last. Right, that capitalism would eventually go away. Now, he was definitely wrong on that part. Capitalism has not gone away. Some would argue that his theory just has not yet come to fruition. I don't know about that. But this theory, this communist theory, said that when capitalism went away, communism would be what replaced it. Okay. Eventually, the workers would realize that they were being taken advantage of, and the workers would rise up, they would take over, they would revolt, and they would kind of take over those the state, and they would take over the means of production. Okay? They would take over the factories themselves, and they would only produce what was necessary in order to function. So there are a lot of issues here. Right? This is something that has been tried in multiple countries. I mean, at the height, I would say, of communism, I mean, there were dozens of communist countries out there, especially when the Soviet Union was at its height. Today, I believe there are only 5 nations that are actually communist. And even most of those have started incorporating many market capitalism into those communist systems. So it's kind of more of a hybrid. I guess I haven't quite defined it, but communism is when the methods of production, the means of production, factories, the industries, are completely owned by the state. There is no private property. It's all public property. Okay? No private property exists. You would not own your house. You would not own anything. It all technically belongs to the state, and they dole it out according to how they see fit. Now, obviously, you're seeing, I imagine right away, some major problems that can happen, and it did. Many many nations that have adopted communism often tend to be very poor, often tend to be very agrarian, and the idea was that if we shared everything, that it would make everyone equally wealthy. In reality, what it tends to do is make everyone equally poor. And, there has not been a true communist state that's really existed. If we were to get deeper into this philosophy, Karl Marx said eventually classes, like economic classes, would just kind of go away, all right, if everybody was equal. That has never happened in any of these communist systems. There's always emerged kind of an upper class, at least in terms of political power. Even in the Soviet Union, which I would say probably got the closest to some of these ideas. There was a class that emerged that was kind of the ruling class there that enjoyed more wealth than your normal citizen, those especially with ties to the government. So communism is the exact opposite of capitalism in a lot of ways. Private ownership not existing, and while it may have eliminated some of the concerns of those that saw capitalists as being evil, it definitely introduced a lot of evils itself in other ways. And again, when we look at nations today that are communists, they're still like Vietnam, China, Cuba. Okay, they are all socialist and communist nations. Like I said, many of them have actually started to turn to more capitalist market enterprise, especially China. I went to China a few years back, and I never forget driving down these roads, and it was nuts. There's a KFC, there's a Papa John's, like there's a McDonald's, like there's a Walmart. You just don't think about these things in communist China. But the fact is, one reason that China has grown as an economic power over the last 30 years is because they have abandoned some of their very strict communist philosophies and adopted more capitalist markets. They've kept a lot of the political control of communism, but some of the economic control has gone by the wayside, and they've thrived because of that. Now, this is a very important chart that I think kind of explains where these things lie on what I keep calling the economic spectrum. And you will have an assignment that you'll need to complete where you'll kind of place different nations. We'll look at some case studies on places like China and Denmark and the former Soviet Union and the United States. We'll be placing some of these on kind of an economic spectrum. So let's kind of once again take a look at what this really means. Communism, at the very bottom, you have laissez faire capitalism. That means hands off, right? So I mentioned that earlier, laissez faire capitalism. The government completely has their hands off of business. They allow business to do whatever they need to in order to operate and function. So when you look at that, on the right-hand side, it says more economic freedom. Okay? And laissez-faire capitalism, that is the most economic freedom. The government doesn't step in and regulate anything. You can do whatever you want in terms of economic freedom. Now, is that necessarily the best thing? No. Okay, because a lot of the things that we enjoy today, or at least have made our nation stronger, things like a minimum wage. Okay, these are things that we've said there at least needs to be a minimum amount that people make when they are working, and this will help provide for at least workers to not be fully taken advantage of. But either way, laissez-faire, I'm just here to say that the extremes, and this is a good philosophy for life, most of the time, when you look at the extremes, they're extreme for a reason, and it's not usually the best. The answer always lies kind of somewhere in the middle, right? I would say America today is floating much more around that regulated capitalism area, which, according to the column on the left, you can see it says more government power as you go up this ladder, and that's absolutely correct. So in regulated capitalism, the government does have a little bit more say. There are certain industries that should be regulated. I mentioned the meat packing industry, right? It's good to know that when you bite into a hot dog, you're not going to look back at it and see a rat head staring back at you, right? It's good that when you take a Tylenol, that you know that little pill's not going to kill you because some company has decided to take a cheap route and put in a bunch of fillers that are poisonous. That is regulation, and there needs to be some regulation. There needs to be some level of safety in place to protect not only workers but consumers as well. I would say that the U.S. also kind of, again, dabbles a little bit in socialism. I mentioned some of those. We don't always call them socialist programs, but they are public education, and there's definitely socialist programs we have in place, and millions of people enjoy those, especially those that survive on Social Security every month. Those are socialist programs. So again, we lie somewhere in the middle, and when you get to the extremes, that's where you start to run into some major problems. But this chart I think really does show that balance between economic freedom and government power, and it is a balancing act. And especially the political parties, Democrats, Republicans, whichever side you're on, we tend to float a little bit between those two middle economic definitions. Guys, I hope this has been a helpful lecture. Again, I know economics is not my strong suit, but I hope I was able to explain it to you well enough that you kind of understand these terms that often get thrown around in our society, often as kind of evil terms. And, it's good to step back and actually say, well, what does that actually mean? And how is that actually put into place? All right, as always, email me if you have any questions. I will be happy to get back to you, and thanks for watching.